Hi, this is Reema, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. What mental models underpin international development? And how do they hold back actors working in conflict-affected countries? In this episode, we speak with Dr. Mareike Schomerus, author of Lives Amid Violence and vice president of the Busara Center, one of the first behavioral science research labs in the Global South. Drawing from 10 years of research by the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, she argues that the international development sector, in its current form, often fails to take into account the experiences and perspectives of people living in violent contexts. And she offers a new language for transforming development in the wake of conflict. We talk about the colonialist thinking that underpins international development, how the sector's unflinching faith in causality creates blind spots for practitioners, and what it means to envision this space anew.
The following is a PSA from the University of Chicago's Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, presenting the Pearson Global Forum. A thin line divides human realities. The fundamental desire for simple human existence remains the same, yet reality is dramatically disparate for many. Join us on Friday, October 20th to hear from global experts as they discuss the topic of disparity and how it impacts people around the world in places like Iran, Afghanistan, and Mexico. This in-person and virtual event is free and open to all. You can find more information at thepearsonglobalforum.org. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Reema. I'm a Pearson Fellow and a student at Harris.
Hi there, my name is Higgins. I'm an MPP student at Harris as well and also a Pearson Fellow.
Hi everyone, my name is Umama Zillur. I'm also a student at Harris and a Pearson Fellow.
And hi, I'm Mareike Schomerus. I'm a visiting lecturer at Harris and also vice president at Busara.
Alrighty. So, can you tell us a little more about like why are you here this quarter at Harris? What courses are you teaching?
So this is my third time that I'm teaching at Harris in the spring term, and I teach two courses this time. I teach qualitative research, which is, of course, within Harris a little bit of a novelty since this is not a very qualitative environment. So I think it's one of the few courses that you can take at Harris where you learn qualitative research and get to do a little experimentation with your own qualitative interests and approaches and so on. And the second course I teach is a hybrid course that we teach across Busara, which is my home organization in Kenya, and here, where we have people design a behavioral experiment. And the actual part that we do in class is the so-called formative research, so where people set up the first round of research where they're trying to understand what really is the context like in which they're going to implement this hypothetical experiment. And so we do a little bit of data collection so that people can actually experience what it's like to design an interview instrument, analyze qualitative, formative data, and then how to use that for experimental design later on.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask what first drew you to kind of this intersection of behavioral science and conflict studies?
Yeah, it sort of piqued my interest probably by now 6-7 years ago. In fact, after I did a lot of ethnographic fieldwork, very qualitative fieldwork in conflict resolution and peace processes and armed groups and so on. And it really occurred to me, or became very clear to me from reading more and more about behavioral science and from cognitive biases and sort of cognitive processes, and primarily actually the point where it becomes very clear that people start remembering things very differently as time passes and sort of change their own recollection of what it is that brought them to a particular place, and which I had seen a lot happening if you do qualitative conflict research. You see that, of course, you see people changing their stories and so on. And I thought, I wonder what that is. And I read a lot more in behavioral science and then thought, I think qualitative conflict studies is really missing a big perspective if it doesn't engage more with behavioral science. Because behavioral science, at the time even more so than now, kind of sits very separately, sits as a mainly quantitative discipline still, even though it's also hugely qualitative, and anthropology is often very behavioral and so on. And so I started looking into what kind of research could be really useful to try and interlink a very serious qualitative perspective, which is what I bring, and a very serious behavioral science perspective. And it turned out there wasn't a lot of that around. And so I set up a little research project to try a particular approach, which we then implemented, and that's kind of how I ended up at Busara.
That's amazing. Can I ask how that's informed? We'll be talking a lot about your book, Lives Amid Violence. How did that inform or what inspired the book project in the first place?
So the book project was inspired by a very technical requirement. I was the research director of a big research consortium, the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, which ran for 10 years. It was hosted at ODI in London, funded by at the time, the Department for International Development, which is the UK's development secretariat, really, at the time was called DFID. And it was looking into that seemingly very simple question of how people survive in situations of violent conflict, and survival being quite a holistic category, not just security-wise, but also in terms of really income, food, services, health services, education, things like that. How do they manage in these situations? And I took over as the research director from my predecessor in 2017, something like that. And then the project came to a close in 2021, and the final deliverable for the final research director was to step back and answer the big question, say, well, if we do 10 years of research with really dozens of partner organizations all over the world, we have over 150 outputs from that particular research consortium, all very specific on many, many different aspects of this question in many nuanced ways. But really, what is a big picture answer that you can give about what you learn, which is actually a really tricky question to answer, right? You have a huge amount of material from very, very different methodological perspectives, very different voices and so on. And so that task fell to me as the research director. And I guess the only way that I could answer that question really was to do something very different. I wouldn't have been in a position to really summarize the research. It's too nuanced, and I make that point very often in the book, that really each individual piece of research stands alone, and if you're interested in a particular part of this broad range of questions, you would really need to go and read the research on this. So I wanted to look at patterns of insights that arise from this. And the patterns of insights that were really striking to me were that over these 10 years, these many outputs, the recommendations that almost every piece of research has to the kind of policymakers, decision makers, program designers, and so on, were very, very similar. They hardly ever seemed to change. And yet also, alongside the hardly ever changing recommendations, hardly anything else ever seemed to change either, right? And so I thought, well, why is it? Why can you keep saying the same things over and over again, and nothing seems to shift in this? And so that's kind of my inspiration for what the book actually ended up being, was recognizing these big patterns.
That makes sense. Can I ask where kind of the title came from originally?
The title of the book, so Lives Amid Violence, Transforming Development in the Wake of Conflict. So Lives Amid Violence, I think, came to me quite early, because it was very clear that I wasn't going to write actually primarily about the people, about whom the research was about, the people who were living in situations of violence, but also a lot about the people who were on the other side, on the implementing side, on the side of trying to deliver development programs and so on to support those other lives of people who were living amidst violence. And so I thought that was a kind of phrase that caught both the fact that everyone's lives gets kind of wrapped up in these situations and in often very unhelpful ways. But it also, I really wanted to have an emphasis on this understanding that amid violence, lives also go on, right? They continue. They are often brutally interfered with, interrupted sometimes, but it remains really crucial to pay attention to how people live, and I think that's particularly crucial for the people who then make decisions over how to support those people, because I would argue that very often their decisions are a bit misguided because they interpret things in a particular way that is not very helpful. The second part of the title, which is a bit grandiose, Transforming Development in the Wake of Conflict. I actually mentioned that in the book, that I had to say that out loud quite a few times to myself to see whether that sounded completely ridiculous, because everything that has transforming in the title is a little bit cringeworthy to me. But it's also important to highlight what direction the book is going in, right? And so from a publisher's point of view, it's very important that people know that this is about international development and that this is in the wake of conflict. So it's not, it doesn't do that division between we're now in conflict and we're now post-conflict, which is usually the jargon that is used. And the transforming part, I think the publisher was very supportive of this title, felt that that it is a book that calls for a genuine transformation, right? And that it's quite serious about this, despite the fact that I find it quite hard to let the word transforming come out of my mouth. But it's asking for a real shift, right? And so that's how the title comes about. But negotiating a title is also not something that the author does alone, I'm just saying. So I think my very original title was a lot more creative, which would have never made it to the bookshelves.
Oh, can we know what it is?
Yeah, I don't remember. Embarrassingly, I shouldn't have said that, but it was definitely something more creative.
Oh, we'll definitely follow up. We won't. No, but to me, it always like struck me as because I feel like the book writes a lot about kind of there isn't really. It's hard to define when a conflict starts or when it ends for people. So it kind of captured that for me.
Great. I mean, I'm delighted to hear. So it does work, kind of.
So I think we're definitely going to get through kind of what needs to be transformed about development and kind of how we think about aid, state building kind of things. But first, can you kind of walk us through what is a mental model and kind of what about the mental model underpinning international development needs to change?
Yeah, so this is exactly where I landed, right? When I looked at all these many outputs and recognized this pattern that recommendations were always the same. And they were basically, in one way or another, every recommendation was saying you have to work being politically aware, things have to be context specific and context appropriate, and any planning needs to be flexible and it needs to work with local realities. And I mean, these are kind of very common policy recommendations that you see, and yet they never really changed. And so I thought, well, why is that? And as I was trying to understand, literally kind of letting it emerge. People can't see me, but I'm grasping things in the air with my hands, but just very much actually a reenactment of how this process felt like, because I was sitting often and I was walking around talking to myself and trying to really grasp what it was that I was seeing. And at some point, it was very, very clear to me that what I was seeing was a mental model underpinning these international engagements in conflict situations that wasn't ever going to be appropriate for what the realities were. And so what that means is, so a mental model is something that we all have in multiple layers and multiple versions, which is basically our kind of go-to, often subconscious or unconscious explanations of how things work, right? So you kind of fall back onto you make sense of the world through the kind of interpretative patterns that you have ingrained in yourself based on your personality, based on your background, your upbringing, your culture, your surroundings, your learnings and whatever. And you just apply that very kind of snappy and say, okay, this is why these things are in a particular way. And so mental model it's not correct to say this is your way of thinking, because it's much more visceral than that. If it was your way of thinking, it would be much easier to say, oh, let's articulate this thinking and now let's rethink, which is how this is often done. But a mental model is deeper than that. It's kind of the blood that flows through that thinking, where people say, but I'm deeply convinced that there's one particular way in which something works and the mechanisms through which something works. And the way I unpack that in the book is through looking at what some of the major approaches are in these situations of violent conflict, and why, in a way, they never really change in their approaches, despite the calls for being context-specific, despite the calls for being politically appropriate and aware, and so on. And how that emerged to me in front of, as I was grasping with my hands in the air for explanations, was that I realized that the language in which international intervention or development speaks about this sounds like you're talking to a bunch of engineers, right? So it's almost like you're sitting in a room with people who've written a blueprint on how to now create a post-conflict society. And I say this a little bit flippantly, but actually it's not that flippant. It's quite stark. If you look at the language that's used in this, it's state building and institution building and building blocks and blueprints and pathways, and I mean it's all very, very technical engineering language. And what that does is it really speaks to one mental model, which is the need for certainty. So there's a real deep need, I think, for people who work in that field to feel somewhat able to say, no, we're on top of this situation. We're kind of in control of this situation. We have a plan, we have sequencing. So yes, clearly we need to, this is a situation that was, for example, a peace deal has been signed. So now we need to go into the institution building and we need to stabilize this. Again, stabilization, right? Like build a foundation that can't slide, very, very architectural. We need to stabilize this. We need to build these institutions. These institutions then need to become accountable. They need to then start acting on behalf of their citizens, at which point the citizens then stop contesting the legitimacy of these institutions. And that's how you kind of bring about a peaceful society. And that mental model of this engineering mindset, I think, for starters, is really misleading. The second part of the mental model is that ultimately all of this thinking that happens in the many nuances in, for example, a state-building effort and so on, really speaks to an idea that deeply believes that economic growth in one way or another will solve all problems, is completely necessary to solve very complex social problems, and that also with the idea that economic growth and economic resources is the most important thing for people, everything becomes a transactional relationship rather than a social relationship where people maybe build an economic transaction on top of a social relationship. The mental model of international development flips it and says, well, the most important thing for people is resources, material wealth. And that's interesting because we see time and time again that this very established idea of the hierarchy of needs, where always the economic need is the big foundation of the pyramid, gets kind of flipped in situations of violent conflict or contestation, where actually people put other needs, where they forego economic opportunities for social connections, for example. And this mental model that ultimately, in really bare bones words, it's the mental model that informs still the idea of homo economicus, right? The kind of rationale driven by the aim to get the best economic decisions done and gain the most benefit from these decisions. That is still a mental model that underpins a lot of the analysis of these kind of contexts.
So on that kind of train of thought and just maybe looking at a more long-term view of this, all of this, I think, my original question was, what's wrong with international development and its relationship to colonialism and ongoing conflict? But I want to rephrase that and ask you, do you think the relationship is a prominent part of the development economic discourse currently? And then kind of unpack why, why that link or the fact that the link is missing is an issue.
The relationship to colonialism. So I think that colonialism has at its heart the same mental model, right? And so let me nuance that a little bit more, what I mean by that. So colonialism, I think often when people speak about it, they think of it actually weirdly, again, the mental model of engineering and administrative things, right? So very often when people speak about decolonization, they think about the administrative parts of this, right? The first wave of debate on decolonialization was countries becoming independent, right? So actually a very technical administrative act. And now I think the debate has moved on, luckily, a lot more, and has realized that there's also deep thought patterns, deep prioritizations of what kind of knowledge is important, what kind of knowledge is even readable to people, and sometimes readable quite literally, right? Whatever is written down. still holds a lot more power than something that is spoken and so on. And so I think the relationship that I see between colonialism and these kind of mental models of international development I guess has a couple of elements to it. One is economic growth, trying to get the best economic gain out of a situation, I would argue is really profoundly part of colonial thinking, right? I would also argue that the idea that you can put people's experiences into certain boxes of administrative units is also part of a colonial colonial administration. That's how they administered people, right? By kind of segmenting them by populations, by segmenting them even within one person. There would be segmentation of what this one person was about. So it wasn't a very holistic view of humans, not a very holistic view of human experience. And I think in so many ways, development replicates that, right? So you have that replicated through like the various sectors. It's very hard for me to really understand how you can separate the health sector from education, or how can you separate health and water and sanitation, right? These two are very intertwined, and yet they're completely different sectors in international development. The second way, I think, or third way maybe, in which this is replicated is in this really, really difficult subject of targeting, of how NGOs, non-governmental organizations, actually deliver their programs to people. They always do this by identifying categories of people that are most, in their view, most eligible or most needy, most in need of what they want to implement, which sounds like exactly the right way of doing it, because it kind of seems very commonsensical, right? You identify who's in need, and then you deliver your program. But in this categorization, actually a lot of thought patterns, I think, continue that take people out of the entirety of the holisticness of their being, right? Their nuances into a very, very narrow identities that aren't necessarily reflective of how people feel. And the work used there is from a colleague who worked in Uganda a lot, and he gave us an example that in Uganda, a lot of programs would target female-headed households, so women who were the head of the family for whatever reason, and they were often targeted with a very particular set of programs, non-food items, so wash basins and soap, and sometimes also food items and so on. But his argument was that a lot of them were actually embroiled in land conflicts, and they were trying to battle the right for their land, which they had lost. And really what they needed was legal advice, legal support. And so while they took the non-food items, it didn't really gel with how they themselves experienced themselves. And so this fragmentation of identities into these very operationally easily implementable categories, I think also is very much part of this relationship between international development and colonialism, because that was an element of control in during colonial times, was to say, let's segment people, right? Let's put them into categories. I mean, categorization along administrative lines was a pretty popular tool in colonial administration. So that, I think, indeed would be one of those mental models, that categorization is a necessity to implement anything that is quite a challenging one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a really helpful way to look at that link, I think. And do you think that that link is now a prominent part of the discourse when it comes to international development?
I think it depends. It can be, and then it also isn't. So it can be. Let's start with the more constructive one. I think it can be because, weirdly, I think. Sorry, let me rethink how I start this, because this is complicated stuff. So it can be when people make it visible that some of these thought patterns still continue, right? That is definitely, I think, very helpful. I think it's very helpful that there is definitely an awareness now that the model of implementing programs that are designed in New York or Washington or Brussels or London or Oslo or wherever, and then are flown into any other part of the world and implemented in similar ways, I think that is very much established now, that that's really not the way to do it. It gets more complicated in many other ways. The first way in which it gets more complicated is that, of course, a lot of the debate continues to be held along the lines of categories, right? So weirdly, and this is what's so fascinating and so frustrating and also necessary to have about this identity debate, I would say that the debate that says we need to really make sure that the discourse on international development isn't held by Western people, but weirdly that still works with categories, right? Really, that is still quite an unnuanced and quite clunky way of actually thinking about what does collaboration between people need to look like. Collaboration that, from where I stand, has to rest in the realization that some countries are where they are right now because they took from other countries, right? So I think for me, that's a very, very good platform from which to have that debate. The then very categorical debate is trickier, right? Because on the one hand, I understand it, I can even support it. On the other hand, I find that it does replicate some of these patterns that aren't particularly helpful. But that's a difficult debate to have. I think we need to engage on the substance of this, and we need to try and figure out ways in which some of these power relationships become very visible, how identity-based interactions are guided in certain ways, in certain traditions that replicate power patterns. All of that is hugely important. But I don't know whether we get that far if we are simply doing this based on identities, because the dirty history doesn't get changed by that. But the future truly has to be collaborative, right? There's just no other way on this planet. That's the only way that we can work together. So I'm very torn about how to have this in the best possible way. And then, of course, I'm also very aware that based on my own identity, it's tricky for me to be the one to say how this debate should be held, right? So this is the kind of cycle in which I then get caught up. And then at the same time, I also think it's too important for people not to show up for it, right? So that then also includes me. So this is really very nuanced and contradictory. But I want to say that also one of the things that I feel is a mental model that's not helpful is to try and get rid of contradiction, right? Which a lot of international development tries to do. It tries to find the one way in which it seems seemingly, this is the right way. And that is very problematic. It will always be contradictory. It will often always be ambivalent, ambiguous. It will feel uncertain, and it will be uncomfortable, right? So in my own learning with this debate, I also try to then remind myself that I truly believe that it needs to be uncomfortable and contradictory, and it often is.
I think it makes sense to be torn about something like this because it is tricky and it is difficult. I know you touched a little bit about this, but at the core of kind of the two books and just your life's work is that we need to handle the experiences and perspectives of the people living in contexts of violence and conflict with care. Can you walk us through your vision for how to transform development in the wake of conflict? And what does responsible engagement in these spaces look like for you? What are some of the ways you kind of hold yourself accountable when existing in this space?
Yeah, I mean, always in incomplete ways, right? That is, I think, also true. So what does transformation really look like? Again, there I can only speak from my perspective. And I can only say that I think it requires an acute awareness of these mental models. It requires an acute, almost check-in mechanisms with oneself. And this is where it gets, again, very tricky. Because sometimes when I talk about this, you can feel like a palpable sense in the room where people go, oh my God, she wants to sit around the campfire and sing songs. I'm like, no, this is not a touchy-feely thing, right? It's really a necessity to understand why you are seeing certain things in the world in the way that you do, to really recognize that is also shaped very much by not just by personality, but by background and culture and education and all these kind of things. And then take that as a real invitation for self-awareness and say, but where's my role in this? Why am I pushing for something like this? Is it because it's my mental model that I fall back on? Is it because it's my sense of this is my seat at the table, so let me take that seat at the table. So these processes are really important. They have nothing to do with me with like going and hugging a tree, right? Because they are actually very, very incomplete in a lot of these processes. So that's where I would argue that's where the transformation really needs to start. And then bringing the perspectives in of the people is one of those seemingly really obvious things to say, and then once you put it into practice, it gets very tricky, right? So a lot of the times people say, well, that requires spending more time with people where you're doing research so that you do better research. That is true, but that doesn't then give me the license to claim that I've now adopted the perspective of someone, right? It's also true that simply by virtue of someone being from the same country than doing research in the same country, that person isn't necessarily closer to the people with whom they're doing research, right? Because, I mean, stratification doesn't just happen along national borders, right? So this idea that representation is a straightforward thing by allowing others to speak through you is a little bit simplistic, because the whole point of research is the researcher creates the knowledge, right? They become the interpreter. And it's tricky when they start speaking for the people that with whom they conducted research, because there is always a translation process. So I would embrace the imperfection there and do by all means everything that is possible. And, you know, obviously our research methods are a lot more aware of this now. We have much more participatory methods and so on. But I think it also remains the case that the process of research, of someone else coming in and working with people to ultimately extract information about their lives from them, there is always a certain power relationship in this. And then being the one person who is then able to write that down, right, in a linear story that then someone somewhere else can read. So this is, I think, another moment of embracing contradiction and trying to do the best that you can. And the best that you can, the accountability that you were asking about, I think just comes from continuing to check, continuing to reflect on why I have certain perspectives. I grappled with that a lot, right? And really also stopping myself often and taking a step back. And I had a jargon dictionary while I was writing this. And I wrote the first draft and also realized that there were many things that I couldn't explain without the typical international development jargon. So I kept a note, and then at the end, when it was almost finished, I did like a word search of the whole document to try and get rid of the jargon that I really find awful, like beneficiary and all these kind of things, right? But actually, I also realized that very often, once I got rid of the jargon, I didn't have anything. I mean, I didn't have the vocabulary anymore, right? So even being aware of this, that sometimes I use language that I dislike because it's the only way that I can speak about this, because I'm so embedded in this system as well, is a contradiction that is one to then make visible, but not necessarily one that I can get rid of, right? But so that to me is very important, that it will always be imperfect. And I fall on the side of saying it's still worth trying with the imperfection. Others fall on the side of saying it's not, right? You shouldn't try that. But that's a good debate to have, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the love-hate relationship with academia is something a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, I think this whole conversation really illustrates how insidious colonial legacies are in development work and how complex engaging with these ideas can be. To shift gears a little bit now, I think a theme that really shines through in your writing is the fact that relationships are really crucial to state building and institutional capacity development. Can you walk us through exactly how relationships function as currency in post-conflict settings? And if I recall correctly, in the book, you focused on a couple of really interesting case studies in the DRC and Afghanistan.
Yeah, so there's many elements to this. So the kind of engineering mindset of state building is very much based on this idea that you build an institution, and an institution in that image is almost imagined as being quite literally the building, right? And fill it with administrative processes, which is where this notion of capacity building comes in very strongly. So building a capacity for a country means to train civil servants to do the very technical aspects of their job, right? I mean, a lot of capacity building is done on spreadsheet training and things like that, very technical stuff. And it really overlooks that, of course, institutions always are hardware and a software, right? And that what the building projects very often is very different from what happens inside. And that's true for anywhere in the world, right? There's the kind of the hardware and the software version of the institution. And the common capacity and state building approaches have kind of overlooked that a little bit. And they've overlooked it because I think, as a little sideline, because I think they took Max Weber's ideas about the state a little bit too seriously and a little bit too seriously too long, over a century, saying this is the only way that a state should look. I think that's a tricky one. But also because the idea of the state in that particular imagery is one of a leveler and a neutralizer. And it really is the idea that the institution should try and counter the social relationships that might have existed in situations where there isn't a democratically elected government, but that's not the format of governance. So this idea of the neutralizer and leveler is still underpins this, and often is projected, as so often these things are in international development, into an infinite future, right? At some point in the infinite future, this institution will function so that it pays equal attention to all citizenry in the country. But when exactly that future will happen, we don't really know. And yet what we see, of course, that in a lot of situations of violent conflict, the very same structures and dynamics that created the conflict in the first place, and often conflicts are very long-running, right? They will, of course, continue once there is a sort of state-building effort. And humans are very clever, right? So they will usurp the state institutions to make sure that they function in the interest of the people who held the power before a conflict officially ended. They will make very sure that that continues to be the case. And so what that also means is that despite institutions being built, there will be continued relationships. And this relationship, state-run on relationship is very important. And the example that you're alluding to in the DRC was done by two scholars who did this very interesting work where they unpacked the relationships that provincial governors had with the capital in Kinshasa, and then tested this relationship, often based on length of knowing the president and so on, against how efficient their provinces were run, their districts were run, and efficiency being measured in ability to pass legislation and budgetary resources and so on. And that it turns out that the stronger your relationship is, the more efficient you can become. So relationships are a real capacity builder. Of course, in the kind of state-building mindset, that's the worst version, right? Because the way I described it is not one way to describe it. The other way to describe it is like patronage, right? And that's the one thing that the idea of the state as the neutralizer and balancer wants to avoid. But it actually is the more efficient way to govern if you are allowing the sort of insight that relationships are capacity, that they aren't just something that needs to be kind of neutralized and controlled away, but that they can be a real engine. And that's very tricky because, of course, these relationships are often held amongst elites, and the international state-building effort wants to make sure that the elites don't run the country to their own interests only. But that's, again, one of those contradictions that requires a little bit of unpacking in each context. Now, is it ultimately maybe better for the populations that are removed from the elites if the elites feel secure in the resources they have access to, and actually it is better for ordinary citizens? Or is it ultimately better for ordinary citizens if the state-building efforts continue to try and break the grip of elites on the state resources, possibly then continuing battle for authority and resources, and ultimately continuing conflictual dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to think about relationships as a tool to pull us out of this infinite future that you've referenced and into more of a concrete present. Very interesting. So again, to pivot to a little bit of a different topic here, in your previous work, you've engaged pretty extensively with the violent conflict in northern Uganda between the government and the Lord's Resistance Army. And in the context of that work, you and your research team applied the concept of a mental landscape, which I think is pretty closely intertwined with the mental model framework that you were describing previously as well. But essentially how I understood it was that it is, how people perceive, interpret, and experience their circumstances today, and how that can be shaped by legacies of war or violence in their particular setting. So I'm wondering, can you speak a bit how you utilized these mental landscapes to contextualize your work in Uganda specifically, and also how you apply that framework to other conflict settings?
Yeah, so the mental landscape conflict is a concept redeveloped, right, through this work. And it really came out of this realization that was quite confusing, that some of our survey work showed that even in situations where the kind of hard indicators had measurably improved for people. So it was measurably more secure. There weren't any more attacks. People were walking at night on the street. There were streets, right, where there hadn't been streets before. People were growing crops that needed longer to mature. All the kind of indicators that you would look at to see whether a security situation is improving. And so even in situations where we saw that, when you asked people whether their lives were improving, they were saying, well, no, they're not, right? And this was actually one of the kind of moments where I thought this is where we need to bring in behavioral science into this conflict study, because we don't get far enough by asking people, because it's confusing. The answer is confusing, contradictory yet again. And so we basically went in with this question to say, is there something specific about people who have been through a very multi-layered experience of conflictual dynamics, of vulnerability, of uncertainty, that makes it harder for them to experience their own recovery, right? If that's how you want to call it. Because arguably, if you can't experience your life getting better, then it's not getting better, right? It doesn't matter whether I tell you 10 times that, no, your situation has improved. And so that's when we use people's own stories of we didn't even use their own stories of conflict. We asked a group of people whether they could tell us something that was important to them, or that happened that was important to them during the time of the conflict. And then we asked another group of people whether they could tell us something that was important to them like 2 weeks ago, very, very recently. And so, because, you have to think very, very carefully of how you talk about these things in an ethical way. And then we asked people to make decisions through some very established behavioral games on kind of altruism and their risk preferences and so on. And we saw that even on this tiny little difference of asking people to situate a particular memory, and not everything that people talked about who talked about the time of the conflict was specifically about the conflict, right? That there was a noticeable difference in how they made decisions. And so that's where the concept of the mental landscape was born, because we then did a lot of qualitative interviews as well, and it's very clear how people carry many, many layers of memories and sense-making with them at all times, and some of them contradictory again, right? And we know, there's a lot of very quantitative research done on the question of whether the experience of violence changes your behavior and your preferences. But to me, that question is almost too narrow, right? So I wanted it to be a little bit wider, and I thought it's more than the experience of a particular violent act. It is your individual memories, your communal memories. It is your own experience of being able to access a particular resource or not. So a continued experience of marginalization, which you then might explain through one of your individual memories, so it becomes reinforcing. So it's really complicated, and it also changes, right? Because if somebody, like for example, has a religious faith, they then interlace their own sense-making a lot with their religious faith. So it's very complex, changeable, movable landscape that really has seasonality, right? That like every landscape has, where sometimes the mountain looks very gray on a day, and then the next day it looks very green. And I find this a very helpful way of thinking about this, that moves us away from the much more bare bones perception survey, which basically asks people, how do you perceive your situation to be, and demands of them to give you a kind of snapshot of what it is like in that particular moment. And this mental landscape where you also then say, but what are some of your communal memories? Why do you think this is the way things are for your community? Why do you think this is the way things are for you? What kind of also disappointments have you had, for example, with generations of international development programs, right, who very often come in and offer a lot of hope and a lot of promise of a better, a future somewhere in the far, far future, which then cannot deliver this. So you have an added layer of people being permanently disappointed and needing to preserve for themselves their sense of hope, right? So they become very reluctant often to engage in the next round of program, and because hope is a precious currency, right? If you can't spend it freely because you need it to keep going, right? That things will ultimately be okay is really an important thing to carry with you. And so that, so the mental landscape one is trying to nuance a lot more what prior was only ever captured in really quite dry perception surveys, and tries to very explicitly, what I've mentioned earlier, bring the many, many elements of humans back together in a way that is still kind of graspable, right? This is also my problem with, even though I kind of came up with this concept of the mental landscape and I need to work on it and nuance it much more, I also find it really difficult because, of course, at the same time, it still tries to capture, like give a catchy term to something that is very, very nuanced and multi-layered and complex and changeable, right? So while I'm trying to say, no, there's a lot of fluidity and it's nuanced, I'm also saying, and here's the label, the one label that makes it really comfortable to talk about it. So again, it's tricky, but if it goes, if it helps towards an understanding, even in this one element of communal versus individual memories, then I think that's already much, much more than we have right now.
Yeah, much more comprehensive.
In Lives Amid Violence, in one section, you describe the success of peace building as being presented as an Excel table that shows the number of attendants at a meeting. I think that this really captures how much of the current practices surrounding evaluation of development projects really miss the mark. Because we want to quantify impact and change, we only look for things that are quantifiable. And in the process, what ends up happening is we're missing rich insight into actual impact, whether that's positive or negative. So I want to ask, how can those working at the intersection of evaluating peace-building efforts strike a balance between measuring progress with precision and avoiding the flattening of personal stories and structural narratives? And that's already a long question, but I want to add on to that. Do you think the broader friction between qualitative and quantitative research kind of feeds into this reality?
Yeah, so I want to preface what I say by saying on any of the points that I make, there are always good examples, right? And I say that because I know that a lot of organizations also do fantastic work and wouldn't measure their peace-building efforts in attendance at meetings. But many also do, right? And a few good stories don't make an approach a successful thing, right? So this is very, very important. And often, obviously, people kind of come back to me and say, but this particular program, it did great work. I mean, yes, I don't dismiss that at all, right? But there are still underpinning mental models that primarily then make many more programs look in this other way. So how can organizations counter this? I don't know whether the burden there is necessarily just on the organizations, because this is another thing that I write about, and this is a very established area of discourse in international development, is the cognitive dissonance with which many international development professionals operate, right? Where they implement things, do things, count attendance at meetings so that they can put it on the M&E spreadsheet, while knowing that that's ultimately meaningless, right? It's really, I think, not to be underestimated how many people work with that permanent cognitive dissonance, because they also believe that the small parts of some of their efforts ultimately are a good thing to do. Or a lot of people also buy themselves some freedom by delivering the spreadsheet-based M&E and say, well, once that's okay, nobody will look too closely at what I'm doing, so here's what I'm actually doing, and that I think is quite constructive, right? So that cognitive dissonance is not to be underestimated. But I also think that the main responsibility on changing this isn't really necessarily just with the implementing organizations, because all implementing organizations look to their funders, right? And the funders will often request these kind of things, will often want reassurance. And there it is again, the mental model of certainty and reassurance, and also of that tricky bit of trust, right? How much do they trust the implementing organizations to really do something constructive? They get a bit of reassurance from seeing the spreadsheet in which the attendance was marked, right? So, and that's complicated to change, because the funders then sit in the treasury of donor countries and ultimately at some point in time get called in front of parliament and say, this is why we're spending money on this, right? And there's work on this a kind of political narrative that needs to really change in this, which is that the idea of the money that is billed as foreign aid isn't money that is so directly improving people's lives, but it's really a political tool of the donor countries as well. And once that narrative would be shifted towards that, then it would be much easier to account for it in Parliament, and a lot of these slightly performative practices might change. So a lot of this, I think, needs to change also in the donor implementing relationship. And then I forgot now the second part of your already very long first question. But just remind me.
How does the broader friction between qualitative
How could I forget? How could I forget that question? So the interesting thing is, the friction for me is not as frictious as it might sound to you. Because for me, no method is perfect, and they all need to speak to each other. And despite the fact that I'm a qualitative researcher, I'm really no purist on this. And I really think of the way I teach qualitative research is to say there are certain questions and certain types of answers that you can only elicit through certain kinds of methods. And some of them are very suitable for just quantitative approaches, and it's very helpful to have a quantitative answer to establish, obviously, the scale of a phenomenon and things like that. But that's not particularly valuable if you don't then also pay attention to saying, well, why do these things happen? And even in the quantitative work, continue to highlight that this doesn't yet help us with understanding the nuance, right? So the two methods really speak to each other. And so for me, that divide actually, despite the fact that I am quite at home in the qualitative methods, that's actually quite a helpful contradiction rather than a friction, because it also allows these broader questions that need to be asked about when is knowing the scale actually important? Is knowing the scale part of a political theater that allows for the very kind of quick soundbitey election-driven arguments and policies? If that's the answer to this, then that's a very, very useful insight to have and say, but then we need to change that that's what people want to hear, right? And at the same time, we can say, but when is something that we know for a fact has only been experienced in a particular way by one person, because we only asked this one person, when is something like that so powerful and resonant that it can actually change people's minds more broadly? And it's completely irrelevant whether this is a phenomenon experienced by one person or by 2 million people. That to me then recreates exactly the humanity that we talked about, right? But the two need to speak to each other, need to work in tandem with each other, and they also, as philosophical approaches, really benefit from having a conversation with each other. We wouldn't have had the kind of insights that we had without both a quantitative survey and then a lot of qualitative and ultimately also some experimental work, and without a lot of conversations between people, right? This is the other thing that's always underestimated. Research is not a lonely undertaking. It becomes a lot better if you speak to each other.
So what are the biggest takeaways that you think policymakers should take away from this book? And what should we have asked you kind of in our hour together?
What are the biggest takeaways? So I would say this idea of a takeaway is a very, very unhelpful mental model, right? Because it always, I know everyone's laughing and I'm kind of laughing myself, but it's true, right? Because ultimately it again tries to head us towards some sort of certainty, right? Some sort of nugget of insight, some sort of solid ground on which to walk. I had a 1-hour conversation and I walk out with 5 takeaways, right? Which is exactly the kind of thing that is really unhelpful, because you can't condense this complexity endlessly. You can't endlessly synthesize. So actually, I would say that a good takeaway is one where everything feels a bit unsettled, right? So not one in the lines of recommendation and the government should do this and the implementers should do this, but in the line of, wait a second, what am I listening to? Why am I doing the work that I'm doing? What can I contribute? What can I not contribute? What fulfills me in this that then might become helpful to others? What fulfills me and might not be helpful to others, I think are really useful questions to ask. And continuing to ask oneself, well, why do I believe that things work in the way they do? Why do I fall back on certain explanatory patterns? Why are they so ingrained in me? So the main takeaway is uncertainty and contradiction. But that's a really, really tricky thing to get your head around, right? And it feels weirdly unsatisfying when people walk out of an event and go, well, that was a bit fluffy. Well, she didn't really tell us what to do. Like, so, I mean, people very often ask me, so what's the solution? I'm like, yeah, that's the mental model, the solution. How could there be one solution, right? These are complex, long, deeply rooted things. There isn't one solution beyond continued engagement and learning and discussion and realization and so on.
I feel like it almost reminds me of, there's a Susan Sontag quote that often comes back, like the only good answers are the ones that destroy the questions. It kind of reminded me of that. But I don't know, it's a scary thing. Like, how do you, like, even know, like, what is underpinning, like, your own mental model, you know? Like, how do you, like, go beyond just, like, rethinking it, you know?
It's very scary. It's very scary to me, and I really, it was very, very hard for me to write this and to kind of also say, no, this is really what I think. This is actually how I think about these things, because it's very clear to me that some people will really like it and others will think this is really naive. I had a comment from someone who said, yes, but your whole idea that this is not about economic growth unless it's redistributed properly, otherwise nobody can benefit. But don't you understand that means some people will have less? I'm like, no, I do understand. That's the whole point of redistribution. So, it's not as if I make like some naive suggestions here, but I do understand completely that for some people, this idea that deeply the mental model isn't always applicable to every concept is very, very challenging. And I catch myself out all the time. Like, I almost would have given you 5 takeaways here, right? Because I'm so conditioned for this as well. And obviously my own mental models can be ripped apart by someone else on a daily basis, right? So it does feel very scary. And it feels also, I don't know, the way I then always think about this is to say, some people listen to me and go, oh, that's a bit naive and cute. And I'm like, yeah, but people still talk about trickle-down economics as workable. That's pretty naive and cute, right? But nobody talks about it in this way. Like, for some reason, that's an accepted way of thinking about this, right? So I'm trying very hard, and I don't mean to suggest that I succeed all the time, but I'm trying very hard to embrace that it feels scary and uncertain, and that I can be attacked, and that I represent contradiction in this, and that has to be part of this as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Mareike Schomerus. This episode was produced and edited by Reema Saleh and Nishita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Julia Higgins, Reema Saleh, and Umama Zillur. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit thepearsoninstitute.org and follow them on Twitter